The first lesson is from the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 7. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." In this reading, may we find God's word for us. Please stand as you are able for the reading of the gospel. The gospel lesson is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. In this reading, may we find the gospel of Christ.
And now, dear God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. And all of the people of God said, Amen. I am grateful for the faithful work and witness of our friend and brother, the Reverend Louis Alfredo Cartagena. And I heard his sermon on this past Sunday on the parables of Jesus, something unexpected. I've been thinking all week about how we need something unexpected, an unexpected blessing. And so I want this Sunday and for the next few Sundays to ask you to think and pray with me about unexpected blessings. Expectations are rather low these days. For almost on every front, the news is not very good. We heard the litany in Dr. Sturm's prayer this morning. It almost seems as if we have run out of hope that things will get any better. There seems to be no end to the escalating conflict in the Middle East between Palestinians and Israelis. The devastating daily images of maimed children and women and broken families and bombed out neighborhoods. Oh God, help us. How we need something unexpected there. And in the Ukraine, there seems to be no end in sight. Almost a month after a downed airliner, and we're still finding human remains in abandoned fields, and responsible parties are still not talking to each other. We need something unexpected there. And closer to home, a crisis at our borders, with trusting and eager children and desperate families caught up in legal limbo, and Washington mired down in politics as usual before going on vacation for the rest of the summer. Oh God, how we need something unexpected here. And the sounds are almost deafening. Send them back. Send them back now. Close the borders. Cut the spending. Stop the borrowing. We're spending and borrowing more than we're taking in. Balance the budgets. Get rid of the deficits. We've run out of money. No new revenues. No new tax increases. Cut, cap, and balance. The sounds are almost deafening. But tragically, it appears that many of the cuts and balancing will be done on the backs and at the expense of those who can afford it the least. Seniors, young families, the marginalized, immigrants, young people trying to go to college, trying to make a start in life, the working poor and middle class. The sounds are almost deafening. And we hear these sounds and words emanating not only in the halls of Congress, but also in churches and temples and synagogues, meeting places where people of faith gather regularly. Send them back. Close the borders. Cut the spending. We can't afford it. Close the doors. Shut it down. Send them away. We can't feed all of these people. We can't do that. We've never done it that way before. The sounds are almost deafening. And so we're busy mining and managing and micromanaging meager resources, doing maintenance rather than mission and ministry, trying to figure out ways to retreat and cut back programs and services and survive for another day. But is there a better way? Is the real problem not that we have run out of money and resources, but that we have run out of meaning and purpose and passion and compassion and vision and imagination? Maybe the real problem is that we are driven by our fears and not by our faith. That we've run out of holy boldness and courageous leadership. Tom Eric recently wrote that the powerful pander to the wealthy, exploit anger among the dispossessed, and drive the nation to the brink of collapse. Too many corporate suites are occupied by short horizon thinkers and risk avoiders who won't invest in innovation and people, and who define ethics as not getting caught. Great universities want fundraisers at the helm, not future-minded thinkers. Religious institutions punish visionaries. Could this be our problem? No visionaries, no vision, no creative imagination, no holy boldness, no real leadership, no courageous leadership. Maybe we're suffering from a failure of nerve and low expectation. Oh God, how we need an unexpected blessing. Years ago, the Quaker theologian, philosopher Parker Palmer told an unforgettable story of a sermon that he preached on the gospel text, the feeding of the 5,000. Palmer was a passenger on a plane that pulled away from the gate, taxied to a remote corner of the field and stopped. You know the feeling, the plane stops and you look out the window and you see you're not on the runway and the engine winds down and your heart sinks. The pilot came on the intercom and said, I have some bad news, and I've got some really bad news. The bad news is that there's a storm front in the west. Denver is socked in and shut down. We've looked at the alternatives, and there are none. And so we'll be staying here for a few hours. That's the bad news. And the really bad news is that we have no food, and it's lunchtime. Everybody groaned. Some passengers started to complain, and some became angry. But then Palmer said one of the flight attendants did something truly amazing. She stood up, took the intercom mic, and said, we're really sorry, folks. We didn't plan it this way, and we really can't do much about it. And I know for some of you, this is really a big deal. Some of you are really hungry, and you were looking forward to a nice lunch. Some of you have medical conditions and you really need lunch. Some of you may not care one way or the other. Some of you here need to skip lunch. So I'll tell you what we're going to do, she said. I have a couple of bread baskets up here and we're going to pass them around, and I'm going to ask everybody on the plane to put something in the baskets. Some of you brought a little snack along, something to tide you over, just in case something like this happened. Some of you got peanut butter crackers, candy bars. Some of you maybe have Lifesavers, chewing gum, Rolaids. And if you don't have anything edible, if you got a picture of your children, your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, or a bookmark or business card, everybody put something in the basket, and then we're going to reverse the process. We'll pass the baskets around again, and everybody takes out what he or she needs. Palmer said what happened next was absolutely amazing. The griping stopped. People started to root around in their pockets and handbags and got something up, opened their suitcases stored in the overhead luggage racks, got boxes of candy and bottles of wine. People were laughing and talking. She had transformed a group of people who were focused on need and deprivation into a community of sharing and celebration. She had transformed scarcity into abundance. After the flight, which eventually did proceed, Parker Palmer stopped on his way off the plane, said to her, did you know there's a story in the Bible about what you did back there? It's about Jesus feeding a lot of people with a little food. Yes, she said, I know the story. That's why I did it. It's a beloved story. Everybody knows it. It's the only miracle story of Jesus recorded in all four Gospels. It appeared the popularity of Jesus had grown to Olympic-sized proportions, and people were following him everywhere he went around Galilee, listening, hoping, wanting to be healed, wanting to be helped, wanting to be made better. Jesus, however, had heard about the death of John the Baptist, was trying to get away by himself, possibly to reflect on his own mission in light of John's fate. The crowds were relentless, though, and like the paparazzi following star athletes and celebrities, they tracked him down. They gave him no rest. And rather than make a run from it, Matthew tells us Jesus saw the heart of their need, had compassion for them, took time with them, cured their sick. Now there's a logistical problem. Now it's late in the day. everyone's stomach is growling, and the nearest McDonald's is about 20 centuries away. In the disciples' minds, it was time to wrap up and send the people away so the team could finally relax. After all, their stomachs were probably growling too. The crowd could get dinner on their own in nearby towns. And so they said, we need to get these people out of here, send them back where they came from. It made sense. It was reasonable. It was the expected thing to do. It was the sensible thing to do. Send them away, close the borders. We don't have resources for all of these people. Listen to this, my friends. 1 billion of the world's richest people consume 80% of the earth's resources. The other 5 billion make do on the other 20%. The world has 840 million chronically malnourished people, most of them women and children. 7 million children in the world under the age of 5 die of malnutrition every year. The Department of Agriculture in our own country estimates that there are 3.8 million families who experience hunger, and up to 12 million families concerned about not having enough food to feed their families. Hunger is real. But Jesus said, you give them something to eat. The other disciples said, send them away. And do we not offer similar suggestions? Let the government feed them. Let social services take care of them. Let the unemployment office help them. Let the homeless shelters take them in. Send them back. Close the borders. We don't have resources for them here. But meanwhile, the government is knocking on the door of faith-based communities saying, when are you going to help? And leaping from the pages of Scripture, Jesus exclaims, do not send them away. You give them something to eat. The disciples began to immediately think practically as they do the math and realize that they don't have the resources to do the job. Their own food supply is pretty meager, just 5 loaves and 2 fish, which basically amounted to nothing. In the face of such a huge crowd, they have crunched the numbers. They've added up the logistical formula, and it just doesn't jive. But Jesus seeks to teach them a different kind of math based not on addition but multiplication. The disciples are thinking scarcity. Jesus sees abundance. Don't tell me what you don't have. Show me what you do have. Bring them to me, said Jesus, who looks at a meal that's the equivalent of 5 dumplings and 2 spring rolls and sees a feast instead of a fiasco. Jesus had the people sit down on the grass, gave thanks to God, gave the food to his disciples. And actually the Greek verb here suggests that he kept giving it to his disciples as they distributed it. He kept giving. A small amount of bread multiplies into a feast that feeds the whole crowd, and there's even some left over. No scarcity, only abundance. With God, my friends, there's always more. More grace, more love, more room, more hope, more peace, more of everything. God takes the smallest that we can offer and multiplies it into more than we can fathom. We can look at the world around us needing to be fed physically and spiritually and immediately begin to worry about our assets and what we don't have. Jesus, however, is calling us to look beyond the logistical problems of addition and think multiplication. The hungry multitudes, people hungry for their next meal, hungry for God, hungry for grace, hungry for healing, hungry for a chance to change their lives. Jesus said, you give them something to eat. Rather than scratching our heads and throwing up our hands in futility when faced with the enormity of the need around us, Jesus invites us instead to take inventory. What do you have to offer? The word is more than you think. If Jesus can feed 5,000 with the equivalent of a poor platter, then multiplying us and our resources to feed the whole world is absolutely no problem. Everyone had enough to eat, and they even gathered the leftovers up. So this story invites us to use our imagination. Somebody said to me a few days ago, I ran into them, they said, I've been to the park 2 or 3 times, and every time I come, you seem to be talking about imagination. And I thought about that. Well, maybe I don't have but one sermon, and that's about imagination. Because it seems to me imagination goes to the very heart of the gospel. And that's why, as I close this up this morning, that I've become I'm such a great fan of Malcolm Gladwell. He's big on imagination. Malcolm Gladwell, one of the staff writers at the New Yorker, has written a number of popular bestsellers: The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, What the Dog Saw. While on vacation, I picked up one of his latest, David and Goliath. Picked it up at the airport here, and I was done with it when I got where I was going. But beginning with the classic tale of David and Goliath and moving through history with such figures as Lawrence of Arabia and Martin Luther King Jr., Gladwell shows how time and time again people labeled underdogs and misfits used their status to their advantage and prevailed through the elements of the counterintuitive, surprise, and the unexpected. The premise here is that there are disadvantages of advantage, and there are advantages of disadvantage. I think Gladwell is on to something here. The powerful and the strong are not always what they seem, and the weak and obviously powerless are often more than what they seem. David, a lowly shepherd boy, defeats the big, bad, bold giant Goliath with a slingshot and 5 smooth stones, and goes on to become king of Israel and one of the greatest leaders in our history. And the moral of the story appears to be that God does not see as mortals see. They look upon outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. This is first and foremost a story about God. God, who knows us better than we know ourselves, what's inside of us, our unrealized potential, our untapped possibilities. God does not always send the best equipped to get the work done. God does not necessarily use the most unlikely person or the most appealing character or the most attractive individual to do what God needs to get done. God does not select the most obviously qualified person to be an ambassador in the world. Sometimes God chooses the weakest person to do the heaviest work. Sometimes God chooses the least qualified to do the most difficult task. Sometimes God can do more with a fool who has no better sense than to trust God than God can do with a know-it-all who's too limited by human sense to dare to think the unreasonable, face the unfaceable, see the invisible, and do the impossible. So it was that shepherd boy David that God used to change the course of Israel's history. And I've come to simply suggest this morning that maybe for such a time as this, God is calling us, you and I in this place, called the park, to make a big difference in this city and in this world. For so it was and so it is, earthen vessels that carry heavenly treasures, people made out of clay, whom God calls and empowers to turn human events, persecuted people, ordinary people, rejected people, outcast, disadvantaged, overlooked, stepped on people that God has touched and lifted and blessed and used to do extraordinary things. God uses ordinary people. Aren't you glad about it? Aren't you glad about it? Because that means that God can use even little old you and me to do some big things. Yes, we can. God can, I declare God can, uses even people like you and I. Praise be to God. Amen.